Hello everyone, my name's Cliff and welcome back to my channel. This is Cliff's Dark Gems. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be comparing novels. And I'm going to be comparing novels that I read a long time ago. Some of them are completely unforgettable, 5-star reads, and I can remember everything in the novel. Other novels I also gave 5 stars, but looking back and looking at the plot, I cannot remember anything about the book. Please stay tuned. Okay, so everyone, this is not just about books that you've read recently that are just a good time, a nice read, and you forget about them. These are books that we're looking way back when I was a teenager, and some of them are big, thick books. And I know that I really enjoyed them. I know that these books had a profound impact on my life, and yet when I think back, I cannot remember them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 4 authors. And I'm going to take 2 books from each author. A book that I found that was completely unforgettable, and that as long as I live, I will remember the plot, I'll remember the characters, I'll remember the world. And then I'm going to take another book by the same author, and a book that simply cannot remember. It's just a blankness there. Okay, so let's start off with Peter Straub. And this is probably the biggest example for me, and it is Ghost Story. Now, I remember absolutely loving this book, loving everything about it. I know that it was a slow burn, introduced to these characters, these old men at the beginning, and this place that they live in. See, I can't remember much about that at all, and I know that it builds up to a climax that was just unbelievable and really affected me. And yet when I think back now, I can't remember at all what happened in this book. Now compare that with another Peter Straub story, Shadowland. And this was just a beautiful book. And I remember everything. I remember the kids, I remember where they go to this uncle, this woodlands. I remember what happens, the magic, the horror, the terror. Now how come these 2 books that are so, well, I wouldn't say they're similar, but written by the same author, why are they so different in terms of my memory or in terms of my memory loss? I would argue that this first book, Ghost Story, I think the slow burn, the fact that it builds up so slowly, the characters and the tension, it doesn't matter how good the ending is. That build up just made it forgettable for me. Okay, so that's Ghost Story. Okay, next up is a big one as well. I really enjoyed Dean Koontz. And when I was a teenager, I read a lot of Dean Koontz. And there were books such as The Bad Place, and especially Watches, that were brilliant reads. They were tense, they were fast moving. And yet I go back and I think, what did I read? I can't remember what I read. Especially with Watches. This was a 5-star, possibly, for me. But the only thing I can remember about it is that there was a doggy involved. I think it was a golden retriever, and I know that Dean Koontz likes these golden retrievers. And the same with The Bad Place. I know this was a very tense book. Why can't I remember the plot? The only book by Dean Koontz that I find unforgettable and that I'll always remember everything about is Intensity. And I think that's got to do with the characters. The protagonist and the antagonist in Intensity were fantastically realized, fantastically well told. I know that the villain in Intensity, I actually said this in my last video, is just completely unforgettable. Edler Vess. He is psychotic, he doesn't care about anything or anyone. The world is there just for the eating for him. And the protagonist is one woman who has to go after him, or is basically threatened by him. China, I'll always remember her. Perhaps that's another thing that makes certain books forgettable, if the characters are not detailed enough. If you look at Stephen King, I will remember most of his stories because his characters are so well fleshed out. And the world and the story is so well fleshed out, the world building, and just makes it unforgettable for me. Whereas Dean Koontz, and I heard this criticism later in his store a lot, is a little bit formulaic. So I think that a lot of the books that I read by him in the past, I mean, I know I also read Whispers, which was great, Lightning, which was an excellent story. But these are books that, when I think about them, I cannot remember anything about the plot at all. Whereas I read Stephen King around about the same time. Okay everyone, sorry about that. We had all sorts of distractions there with my doggy. But let's try and carry on. And I was talking about Stephen King and the fact that I read him at a very similar time to Dean Koontz. And yet all of his stories are ingrained in my mind. And there's nothing I can forget about him. Whereas Dean Koontz has just gone in one ear, out the other. So yeah, there's that. Let's talk now about the man himself, Stephen King. These books were actually written with Peter Straub. And it's weird that the first one, The Talisman, Stephen King and Peter Straub, I can remember very clearly. It's like a wonderful quest novel. The young boy that has to go across this land, try and save his mother. I have spoken about it already. But then the follow-up was Black House. And Black House is pretty much just a black hole in my mind. Cannot remember a damn thing about it at all. And I think that might have been to do with the fact, not just that it's a bad book, because it was a very good book in the second half, but the first half of the book just was slow and dull. And it only really took off about halfway, 3/4 of the way through. So I mean, if you think about that, along with Ghost Story, slow build up, perhaps it lost my interest a little bit, but then picked up towards the end. Maybe that has something to do with me forgetting about the whole. Because if you look at the sum of its parts, maybe first half boring, dull, slow burn, slow build up, second half magnificent. Turns into a 4 or 5 star read for me. And yet, if I look back 20 years ago that I read the book, it's just gone from my mind. So you don't remember the book as a whole because parts of it didn't live up to expectations. And I think that's true. Now the other Stephen King books as well. I remember one that's probably got my lowest rating, and that is The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And I know a lot of people love this, but for me it was completely forgettable because the main character loved baseball, and being South African, I'm afraid I don't even know anything about baseball, and I don't enjoy it. I'm a rugby man, a cricket man, tennis man, so baseball is just something completely alien to me. And you're more likely to forget about a book if it's got something like that in it that you have no interest in at all. Right, so that's Stephen King. Now the final author I want to talk about very briefly, and I don't own the books anymore. They basically got lost in the move, and that's Neil Gaiman, one of my favorite authors once again. The book I want to talk about that was fantastic, and I still remember so much about the book, and that was Neverwhere. Now Neverwhere was about this world underneath London, the London Underground, and I remember so much about it. And there's another book that I thoroughly enjoyed, and that was American Gods. And yet the only thing I can remember about it is that there were these older gods and there were these new gods. I cannot remember the plot, I cannot remember the story. I do remember that the story was very strange. It was terrifying in parts, but it was very, very strange, and I think it required a little bit more concentration to put all the plot threads together, and maybe that is why it is something that I've forgotten about. So all in all, it's just a little bit of everything. Slow burn, forgetting about plots, forgetting a novel being too complex, maybe character work not strong enough, world building not strong enough. These are perhaps all reasons why you forget about a novel, even if you know that you've loved it. Okay, my final thoughts on this topic is how can we remember the books that we love? And what are some hints and tricks and tips about remembering those books and not forgetting about them? Think back when you were at school. How many of the books that you read and learned about at school? George Orwell, Animal Farm, Lord of the Flies, and Catcher in the Rye. How much of those books can you remember? And I would guess quite a lot. And the reason being for that is the difference between active reading and passive reading. Now, if you find yourself finding a book that you really enjoy, you're going to take a lot more in if you read actively, if you focus on that story and nothing else. Now, that's easier said than done in today's age, technological age, where there's so much happening, where there's Facebook, there's Twitter, it's kind of busy lives that we have to leave, the age of information, and it's kind of difficult to read really actively as opposed to passively. I also want to bring something else up here. I don't think I'll ever read audiobooks or listen to audiobooks. And this, I have no problem with people that do. I really don't mind. And sometimes it might be the best way for some people to actually read a book or listen to a book. But I just think that if you have an audiobook, the direct link between you and the story is kind of cut off. You're not going to hear the voice of the characters as if you're reading a book. You're not going to hear the voice of the narrator in the way that you should be listening to the voice in your imagination. And remember that you're reading a book at your pace, in the way you see the words and the sentences before you. With an audiobook, it's someone else narrating a story. So it's kind of second-hand that you're getting the book. And I think that also affects the ratings that you're going to give the book. Because, so I think it's a big difference between reading the book yourself and listening to someone else read the book for you. But, once again, if that's something that you enjoy, if that's something that actually makes you happy, then go for it. That's just my opinion, of course. Another way we can remember a book that we love. And remember, this is not necessarily for every book. I said in the beginning, some books are just fun. You read them, put them away. Whether you remember them or not, it's not important. But if you're reading a book and you find it's really special, take some notes. Make little summaries of the chapters. Make notes in the book if you're fine with that. But then you're thinking about what you're reading. You're making connections. You're making little mental connections. You're thinking about the themes. You're thinking about what's happening in the story. Those are just little tips. I'm sure there's a lot more for remembering a book that you love, how you can go about doing that. So, that is my little discussion video for today. I hope you enjoyed that. I had fun thinking about this. Let me know what you think. Is there anything I missed out on? And also let me know, do you also forget books that you love sometimes? In the meantime, take care of yourselves. Keep those pages turning, and cheers.